Freezing rain doesn't tap at a window so much as gnaw at it. A slow, patient ticking that works its way in behind the eyes somewhere around the 10th hour of a 12. To everyone at Carroll Valley Regional that night, Quinn Archambault was just the float. The casual they'd dragged in to cover a sick call, the one who ran bloods and emptied basins and was told, kindly and then less kindly, to keep her hands off the central lines. None of them knew that in another country, in a life she'd folded up small and buried, men with rifles had once said her call sign like it was the only word that could save them. They'd learn it before the night was out, when the rotors came in, low and ugly over the ice, and someone started shouting for Tamarack. The emergency department, in a town like this, hummed at a frequency you stopped hearing if you let it. Quinn had stopped hearing it on purpose. She stood at the supply alcove off Bay 3, restocking the IV start kits nobody else wanted to count, and she let the noise wash over her, the way you let cold water run until it goes warm. Monitors chirping out of sync, a drunk in the hallway singing something half in French. The charge nurse's clogs coming down the corridor like a judge's gavel. "You're floating, so float," the charge nurse said, not looking up from her tablet. Pruitt, 26 years on the floor, and every one of them showing in the set of her mouth. Vitals, turns, restocks, we're short, and I don't have time to babysit somebody who isn't ours. Don't touch the lines in 2 and 4, those are mine. You good with that? I'm good, Quinn said. Her voice came out flat. She'd learned to keep it flat the way you learn to keep your weight off a bad knee. Good. Pruitt was already turning away. There's a mess in 5. Wear the gown. Quinn didn't argue. You didn't take casual shifts in a float pool if you needed people to look you in the eye. You took them because they let you disappear. No unit, no team, no Christmas potluck. Nobody asking how your weekend was or whether you were sleeping. You showed up, you plugged the holes in a leaky boat, and you clocked out at dark 30 and drove home on roads nobody else wanted. It suited her. For 6 years she'd made calls that decided who got to keep breathing and who bled out in the dirt with their boots still on. And now she wanted nothing in her hands heavier than a stack of gauze, and somebody telling her she wasn't qualified to push saline. She cleaned 5. She turned the old man in 8 who had a sacral wound that smelled like the truth nobody wanted to say out loud. She charted in the margins of other people's charts, and around 8:45 she happened to be passing Bay 6 when the second-year resident put a needle into a vein that wasn't there. The kid, Okada, his badge said, and he did look like a kid, like somebody's nephew home from his first year of med school, had a 16-year-old with a fever and a heart rate climbing toward a place nobody wanted it to go. Sepsis, probably. The boy's veins had clamped down the way veins do when the body starts hoarding blood for the organs that matter. And Okada had blown 2 already. His hands had that fine tremor that means panic is winning. The monitor was getting louder. Pruitt was on the phone 3 meters away, fighting with a lab tech over a hemolyzed sample, her back to the whole thing. Quinn felt the old twitch in her fingers. Muscle memory. The animal part of her that wanted to shoulder the kid aside, grab the drill, and put a line straight through the boy's tibia into the marrow, fast and brutal, and done in 8 seconds. She didn't. She slid the curtain back another foot and stepped in quiet, her runners barely squeaking on the floor. "I've got it," Okada said, without much conviction. "You're collapsing his veins, doctor." She kept her voice low, almost gentle, and she didn't look at him. She looked at the boy's forearm. At a vein she could feel more than see, a sluggish blue rope rolling under the thumb. She pressed against it. Distract him with your other hand. Anchor below the sight. Don't chase it. He could have told her to leave. His pride was right there, climbing up his throat, but the boy's eyes had gone glassy, and the panic was bigger than the pride. And so the resident anchored the skin and held still. Quinn took a smaller catheter than he'd been using, came in at a flatter angle, and threaded it on the first pass. A bright bloom of red in the chamber. She flushed it, taped it, opened the fluids. He needs cultures and a fluid bolus, and the antibiotics he should have had 20 minutes ago, she said, already stepping back toward the gap in the curtain. And he needs a real set of eyes on that rate, because if he tips, he'll tip fast. She paused. You did fine. Veins like that fool everybody. She didn't wait for thanks. She'd learned a long time ago that thanks didn't come. And that wanting it was a way of bleeding you couldn't tourniquet. She went back to the supply alcove and counted catheters until her pulse came back down. The break room had a coffee maker that produced something the color and roughly the flavor of road tar. She poured a cup anyway and sat in the corner chair with the cracked vinyl seat and let the heat scald the roof of her mouth. Because the scald was a thing she could feel that didn't hurt in the old way. Her left knee throbbed where a piece of someone else's vehicle had rearranged the cartilage in a place she tried not to name. She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands. Outside the window, the freezing rain had turned the parking lot into a black mirror, and the trees along the ridge bent under a coat of ice that caught the lot lights and threw them back cold. Just a float, she told herself. That was the whole job. You are nobodies. You are safe in the shallow end. Nobody is going to ask you to do the thing again. She had nearly believed it. Pruitt's head came around the door. Brakes done. We've got Orange calling about a possible transfer they can't fly. So the bridge is going to get ugly. I need eyes on the board, not on the ceiling. On it, Quinn said, and she dumped the rest of the tar in the sink. The vibration didn't start in the air. It started in her teeth. She was standing at the supply cart outside Bay 3 with a stack of trauma dressings in her hands, and her body knew before her mind would let it. A civilian medevac helicopter, the bright ones that put down on hospital pads, has a high, thin, frantic whine, a sound like an anxious wasp. This was not that. This was a deep, even, rhythmic thud you felt in the long bones of your legs before you heard it. Thump, thump, thump. It came up through the concrete pillars of the building and rattled the ceiling tiles in their frames. A CH-146 Griffon, fully loaded, coming in heavy and low, and under the first one, lagging a half second, a second set of blades chopping the same wet air. The dressings slid out of her hands and fanned across the floor. In the department, nobody else reacted. The drunk in the hall was still singing. A monitor in 2 was alarming for a lead that had come loose. Pruitt was 3 steps down the corridor, scolding somebody about a wheelchair left in a fire lane. They couldn't feel it yet, but Quinn could feel it in her molars and the soles of her feet and the scar tissue behind her knee, and her hands, steady as a level when she'd been seating that catheter in the boy's arm, started to shake. She shoved them into the pockets of her scrubs and put her back against the cold wall and thought, very clearly, no, not here, not me, not tonight. Then the red phone at the charge desk rang. It almost never rang. It was the direct line, the one that connected to dispatch and the regional bridge for the things that didn't go through the front door. Pruitt stared at it like it had grown teeth, then snatched it up. Caro Valley, this is, her voice, all gravel and authority a second ago, thinned out to a reed. No, we're not a trauma center, we're a level. You can't put down here. The roof pad isn't rated for. Wait, she stopped. Whoever was on the other end hadn't called to ask. The thudding outside swelled until the frosted glass of the ambulance bay doors buzzed in their tracks, and a sheet of half-frozen grit blew past the lit windows like the whole sky had come loose. "They're landing in the lot," Pruitt said to no one, the phone still pressed to her ear. Then louder, cracking, code orange. "We've got incoming. They're not even routing through us. They're just coming." "Clear the bay." The department came apart at the seams. It was not the choreographed scramble of a trauma team that drilled together. It was a dozen civilians who suddenly understood that something larger than the hospital had arrived and was going to come through whether they were ready or not. A crash cart got jammed in a doorway. Okada went the color of the bedsheets. The staff physician, Whitfield, an unhurried man who'd spent 20 years setting wrists and reading chest films, came out of the back at a dead run for the first time in living memory. "Archambault!" Pruitt found her against the wall and pointed a shaking finger. "Get out of the way. Stand by the lockers. Do not touch anything in the bay." Quinn didn't argue. She pressed her shoulder blades into the cool tile, and her heart slammed against her ribs. And a part of her, a loud and frightened part, screamed at her to walk out the staff door and get in her rusted-out Civic and drive until the road ran out at some lake. The smell came first, the way it always did. Jet fuel, seeping in through the intake vents, mixing with the bleach and the antiseptic and the cafeteria's burnt coffee. It smelled like a flight line. It smelled like the worst mornings of her life. The bay doors didn't open. They were kicked. 4 men came through them out of the freezing dark, and they did not belong to the same world as the pastel scrubs and the white coats. Plate carriers cinched tight over cold weather kit, helmets still on. The multicam turned almost black where the freezing rain had soaked it. There was real grit on their boots, not the salt gray slush of a valley parking lot, but the burnt residue of a range, cordite and frozen mud. They moved like one organism, fast and low and certain, and between 2 of them rode a litter, and on the litter a man was dying. "Move," the lead one said, and it wasn't loud, but it cut through everything. He had a beard frozen at the edges and a jaw like a cinder block, and a flash on his shoulder Quinn recognized with a lurch that turned her stomach to water. He swept a gurney out of the path with one arm, and it crashed into the wall. The team put the litter down on the nearest open stretcher, ignoring the resuscitation bays entirely, ignoring the room. Whitfield got there first with Okada in his wake. "I'm the physician on. Let me. We need to get him to a resus bay. We need O-neg, mass transfusion." The lead operator stepped into him. Not a shove, just a wall of a man putting one gloved hand flat against a doctor's chest, and the doctor stopping like he'd walked into the side of a truck. "You set arms," the operator said. It wasn't cruelty. It was triage. His eyes were already moving past Whitfield, scanning the huddle of staff, looking for one face among the frightened ones. "Where is she?" Quinn stopped breathing. She had time, in that suspended second, to see the man on the litter the way she'd been trained to see, which was all at once and without flinching. His left forearm ended in a field dressing, soaked through and refrozen, the hand gone. A junctional wound high in the thigh, packed and wrapped. A combat tourniquet twisted so deep into the muscle. It had stopped being a tool and become part of him. But none of that was the thing killing him. His chest moved wrong, too much on one side, the rise lopsided and sucking. And his neck, God, his neck was swelling, the trachea shoved off center, and there was blood in his airway, frothing pink at the corner of a mouth, half hidden by a strap. Tension building in the chest and an airway he was losing at the same time. 2 clocks running, both nearly out. "Sir." Pruitt stepped forward, brave and useless. "I'm the charge nurse. If you tell me what unit, I can call the liaison. I can. I don't need a liaison." The operator turned a slow circle, and his voice when it came up was not a request. It filled the room and pressed the air flat. "Dispatch pinged her license to this building. So I'm going to ask once more." He looked past Pruitt, past the crash carts, past the resident frozen with his mouth open. "Where is Tamarack?" The name went through Quinn like a current. It belonged to a person who had died in a way that doesn't make the news. A person she'd left in a tent in the dust with a duffel bag and a flag patch and a promise never to be her again. Nobody in the room moved because nobody in the room knew her. To them, she was the float, the casual, the woman who'd mopped 5 and turned 8. On the litter, the man arched. His whole body went rigid and then slack, and the frothing at his mouth got worse. And the operator holding pressure on the stump of his arm looked up with eyes gone wild and young. "Driscoll, he's losing it. He's circling." Driscoll. The name landed somewhere in the buried part of her and stuck. The big man's discipline cracked, just for a heartbeat. She saw the panic come up through the calm like water through ice, and he turned and shouted at the whole room, his voice breaking on the last word. "I need a surgical airway, and I need it now. Somebody get me Tamarack." Quinn closed her eyes. The hum of the fluorescence went away. In its place came the memory of a different roar, hot wind off a tarmac, a young face she couldn't save no matter how fast her hands moved. She was so tired. She was so tired of being tired. If she stepped off this wall, the float was gone forever. Quinn Archambault, who emptied basins and got told to keep her hands clean, would stop existing, and the other one would be standing here in the cold light with everyone watching. The man on the litter made a sound she had heard before and never wanted to hear again, a wet rattling sound that the body makes when it's deciding. She opened her eyes. She looked down at her own hands. They had stopped shaking. She pushed off the wall. Her runners didn't squeak this time. She crossed the floor past Pruitt, who flinched back as if Quinn had become someone else in the space of 3 steps which she had. She walked past Okada, frozen, and past Whitfield, who looked at her like she was a hallucination, and she stopped in front of the wall of a man called Driscoll and looked up at him. "Move," she said. His eyes went wide. He didn't recognize the face. 3 years. And a different haircut and 20 pounds will do that. But he recognized the tone, the way you recognize your own name. He stepped back without thinking, and the whole team's center of gravity shifted to her the way iron filings shift to a magnet. She looked at the dying man and she did not see a patient. She saw a problem coming apart and a list and the order of the list. "What's his name?" "Mahoney," Driscoll said. "Corporal." He took a frag from a charge that cooked off early on the range. We were 40 minutes from the trauma center, and the bird couldn't make Ottawa. The icing was airway first. She was already turning. "Pruitt." The charge nurse stared at her, mouth opening and closing. You're not credentialed to Pruitt." Quinn didn't raise her voice. She just let 3 years of a thing this woman had never seen come up behind her eyes and sit there. "I need a crick kit or a scalpel and a 6-0 tube and a bougie. I need a 14-gauge needle, the longest you've got. I need a chest tube tray, a 32 French, and a pleur evac. Skip the prep. Bring it now, or this man dies on your floor and you spend the rest of your career explaining why you stood there. Go." Pruitt went. She practically threw the trays onto the edge of the stretcher and then stood back hyperventilating, her eyes ricocheting between the armed men and the blood pooling on the linoleum. The airway was first because the airway was the faster killer. His neck was a ruin of swelling and blood. There'd be no putting a tube through that mouth. No time to try and no road to find. Quinn ran 2 fingers down the front of his throat, found the notch she wanted, the soft give of the membrane below the hard ridge of cartilage. No freezing, no time. She'd done this on the worst day of her life on a kid 2 years younger than this one. Hold his shoulders, pin him. Driscoll and the young operator put their weight on Mahoney, and the third man took his head and held it still, and said something low and steady into his ear, a voice for a man who couldn't hear it. "Mahoney, I'm sorry," Quinn said, quiet, and she put the blade in. A horizontal line, a turn of the handle, the bougie threading down into the dark, the tube sliding over it. She pulled the bougie, hooked up the bag and squeezed. For 1 terrible second, nothing. Then the chest moved. Only the right side, lopsided, but it moved, and the wet rasp from his throat changed pitch. Air going somewhere it could be used. "He's got an airway," she said. "Now the chest. He's tensioning." The trachea was still shoved off to the side, the pressure inside the cavity squeezing his heart like a fist. She found the space high on the chest below the collarbone, second rib down along the line of the nipple, the skin clammy and cold and drawn tight as a drumhead. She drove the long needle straight in. The pop came through her fingertips, that small obscene give, and then the hiss. A long, ugly rush of trapped air escaping the catheter, and behind it, a fine spray of pink that hit the front of her scrubs and turned the pale blue dark. The man on the litter dragged in a breath that wasn't a rattle. The blue tint that had crept around his lips pulled back to a mottled gray. His trachea, off in the wrong country a second ago, drifted back toward the middle of his throat like a compass finding north. "Sats are coming up," Okada whispered from somewhere behind her. He was staring at the monitor like it was speaking a language he'd only read about. "Heart rates. It's coming down. It's a patch," Quinn said. Her voice had gone hoarse and very calm, the calm that lives on the other side of fear. "The needle clogs or kinks, he tensions again. He needs the tube." She held out her hand without looking. Scalpel. There was no lidocaine and no time to grieve about it. She found the space along his flank, 5th rib, the line under the armpit, and cut. Dark blood welled up at once, fast, more than air alone, a hemothorax, the cavity filling. She traded the blade for a curved clamp and pushed it through the muscle, and the wall of him resisted and then gave, and she put a gloved finger into the hole and felt the slick hot edge of the rib and the soft give of the lung beneath, and swept it clear of clot. To the people in the room who'd never seen it, it looked like butchery. It looked like she was tearing a man apart. To Driscoll and his team, it was the most beautiful thing they'd seen in a year. Somebody doing the only thing left to do, fast, without flinching, without asking permission they didn't have time to grant. "Tube," she said. Whitfield moved. It surprised her. The unhurried man tore open the chest tube and put it in her palm and didn't say a word, just watched with his mouth slightly open as she clamped it and fed it into the cavity, aiming high and back, and the dark blood came rushing up the clear plastic in a column. "Hook the plur evac. Get me the TXA if you carry it. Run it over 10 minutes. Get Oneg out of your fridge. I know you have it. Every shop your size keeps 4 units for exactly this. Start the warmer." She straightened. Her knees had begun to shake again now that the worst of it was past, and she locked them and stayed up by sheer refusal. Her hands were red to the wrist. He needs the trauma center and a surgeon, but he'll make the drive now. For a moment, nobody moved. The monitor beeped a rhythm that meant something close to alive. Mahoney's chest rose and fell, lopsided and tube-fed but rising, falling, rising. Then the spell broke. Whitfield came back into himself, all at once, the physician switching on. Right. Let's package him. Call Criticall. Get me a trauma bed in Ottawa. Tell them sucking chest wound and a traumatic amputation, stabilized. And find out if Orange can move now that the front's pushing east. His staff, unfrozen, surged forward and took the stretcher, and for a strange second, the operators let them. Stepped back and let the civilians do the part. The civilians were finally good for, and formed instead a loose ring around the bed, eyes still moving, still hunting a threat that lived in a different country. They wheeled Mahoney out, the wheels squeaking down the long, bright hall, and the sound of it faded the way sounds do. Quinn didn't follow. She stood in the middle of the bay and looked at the puddle on the floor catching the overhead lights, and at the dark Rorschach smear across her own front. And she felt the room go quiet around her. Pruitt was by the desk with a clipboard, hugged to her chest like a shield, watching her with a face that didn't know what it was allowed to feel. Awe and horror and something close to shame. Quinn turned and walked to the soiled utility room and shoved the door shut with her hip. It smelled like bleach and old urine, and it was, for once, exactly the right place to be. She ran the deep steel sink, as hot as it went, and put her hands under it, and took the rough pumice soap and scrubbed until her skin went raw, and the water at the drain ran from red to pink to clear. The copper smell stayed up in her sinuses where soap couldn't reach. Her left knee buckled, and she didn't fall, just caught the cold lip of the sink and held it, and breathed through the thing in her chest that wanted to come up. The thing she'd kept down for 3 years by never, ever doing this again. The door creaked. She didn't turn. She knew the weight of those boots on a hard floor. Driscoll filled the doorway. In the small, bright room, he looked enormous, and he smelled like cordite and fuel and cold, like a world she'd burned to the ground on purpose. He didn't say anything for a moment. He pulled a paper towel from the dispenser and held it out, and she took it and dried her shaking hands. The dispatcher said the nearest trauma center was 50 minutes in good weather, he said. His voice had lost the edge it had carried out front. It was low and worn through. Mahoney didn't have 50 minutes. He had about 5. You stormed a civilian hospital, Quinn said, eyes on the drain. You came down out of an ice storm into a parking lot. You're going to be filling out paper for a year. I knew you were here. He said it simply, like it answered everything. She turned then. His face was caked in range mud, his beard matted, and his eyes were the kind of tired sleep doesn't touch. It's not Tamarack anymore, she said, barely a whisper. It's Quinn. I run bloods. I empty basins. I cover sick calls, and I keep my hands off the lines. I disappear. That's the job. You can call yourself whatever you want. He leaned a shoulder on the frame. You can put on the ugly scrubs and tell that woman out there you're not allowed to touch a chest. But the second the floor dropped out, you didn't run for the door. You took the room. You ran that resus like you never left. He shook his head, slow. Hands like that don't quit. They just wait. I hated every second of it, she said. No, there was no cruelty in it, just the certainty of a man who'd watched her do it. You hated the smell. You hated being reminded. You didn't hate the work. You were the best medic I ever had in the worst place either of us will ever go. And that doesn't wash off in a sink, no matter how hot you run it. He reached into a pouch on his kit and took out something small and worked it loose with 2 fingers. A coin, heavy and dark, a regimental crest worn smooth on one face. The kind of thing handed quietly between people who've carried each other. He set it on the steel rim of the sink, next to the harsh institutional soap. "Mahoney's going to live," he said, "because of you, again. If you want to keep being a ghost, I won't drag you out of it. We'll be gone before your admin even finds the right form." He pushed off the frame and put a hand to the door. "Driscoll." He stopped, looked back over his shoulder. "Tell Mahoney he owes me a new set of scrubs," she said. A grin cut through the grime on his face, tired and real. "I'll tell him." He pulled the door open and the cold of the corridor came in. "Good to see you, Tamarack." The door swung shut and she was alone with the coin. She didn't pick it up. She stood and looked at it, the crest catching the hard light, and she didn't pick it up, because picking it up was admitting it was hers. She left it on the rim of the sink, a small dark monument to all the things she hadn't managed to bury as deep as she'd thought. Then she took a breath, and for the first time the bleach came through clean over the copper, and she smoothed the front of her ruined scrubs with both hands and pushed back out into the department. The Griffons were already gone. The thud had drained out of the concrete and left behind only the gnaw of the freezing rain on the windows and the steady, abrasive hum of the lights. The staff were clustered near the desk, talking low, going quiet when she came through. Whitfield was at a workstation finishing the transfer note, and he looked up at her and held her eyes a beat longer than he needed to, and gave her the smallest nod she'd ever been given, and went back to his typing. Okada stood by the empty bay, staring at the discarded wrappers, and the dark stain like he was trying to memorize a thing he didn't have words for yet. Pruitt put down her phone as Quinn passed. Archambault. Her voice had lost all its gravel. "The administrator on call wants? They want to talk to you. About the procedure. About credentialing and scope, and they want to talk to you." Quinn stopped at the supply cart outside Bay 3, where the trauma dressings she'd dropped an hour and a lifetime ago were still fanned across the floor. She crouched and gathered them and squared the edges and slid them back into the drawer where they belonged, one neat stack. "Tell them I'm on my break," she said, and her voice had come all the way back to flat. She closed the drawer with 2 fingers. "And tell whoever's on next that somebody needs to mop Bay 1. She straightened, and her knee held, and she looked at the woman who'd spent the whole shift telling her she wasn't anyone's. "I don't do the heavy lifting, I just float." She went back to counting catheters, and outside the ice kept falling. And somewhere in the dark to the east, a Griffon carried a man who would wake up in 2 days in a city hospital and ask the nurse who he had to thank, and nobody there would be able to tell him, because the woman who'd reached into his chest with her bare hand had already clocked out and driven home alone on a road no one else wanted, the coin she hadn't taken still sitting on the rim of a steel sink. Waiting the way her hands had waited, the way it seemed she'd always known it would.